Hello and welcome to another episode of StratcomTalks. I'm your host, Jafar Hasnan. Today we are going to be talking about some of the biggest human rights challenges on a global scale. We will also be looking at how we can ensure effective communication of human rights among the masses. To discuss all this and more, today I'm joined by Muneeb Qadir. He is a human rights lawyer based out of Pakistan. Muneeb, thank you very much for joining us today on this podcast.
Thank you for having me, Jafar.
All right, so let's start the discussion. My first question to you, Muneeb, which also happens to be the main theme of today's discussion. What are some of the biggest challenges to human rights in today's world?
Given the complexities of the modern world, and we are in the middle of a pandemic, what I'm seeing, and it's not just me, but this is a concern, there is a rise in, right-wing populism in politics. And this is a phenomenon which is being witnessed all across the globe. So it's even Western democracies, and that is what is a bit frightening. Turning towards or tilting towards right-wing rhetoric, for instance, if you look at what's going on in France, in French politics, the presidential election just around the corner. Somehow it's the right-wing parties, people like Marine Le Pen or Eric Zemmour, who are gaining traction. Now, Eric Zemmour, people like those, they have openly, spoken out against immigration. They have made very problematic Islamophobic or anti-Semitic statements. I know about Eric Zemmour, his Holocaust denial tendencies, and this is all in public.
Right.
Secondly, we are also seeing, as part of this right-wing populism, a very hostile attitude towards refugees and asylum seekers. Just a few weeks ago, and I hope that a lot of our listeners would know that, around 27 individuals lost their lives. They got drowned while, undertaking a channel crossing from France to the UK. And it's the response of, the states, whether it's France or whether it's the UK. It's very defensive, and it's not in accordance with the protections which are guaranteed to refugees, which are guaranteed to individuals. Somehow, states are trying to pin it down on non-state actors. So, for instance, Priti Patel, who is the Home Secretary of the UK, she has said that all of that happened not because the UK failed to provide safe and legal routes to immigrants, but it happened because of human traffickers. And so, the states and those who are running the state apparatus, all of them are trying to all of them are trying to point fingers at someone. They're trying to find scapegoat on whom they could pin it all up. I mean, fine, I understand that, human traffickers and human smugglers, they are a problem. But who provides them with the opportunities to be able to put people's lives in peril? Similarly, I'm seeing a politicization of human rights. For instance, I come from Pakistan, and then there's a lot of whataboutery which happens, emanating both from my own country as well as from the other countries to whom Pakistan keeps on addressing its grievances. So, for instance, Pakistan just recently, yesterday, they hosted an OIC summit, and they made a case for the plight of Afghan, the lack of food, the humanitarian crisis, or the famine which has taken over after the Taliban regime installed itself. And on the other hand, the international community is talking about Pakistan's human rights. We've seen something happen in Sialkot, for instance, and a rise in mob culture. So they ask the Pakistani government, what are you doing about it? And then the Pakistani government turns back and says, but what are you doing about the Kashmir situation, which is huge humanitarian crisis spanning 7 decades? Or what are you doing about Palestine? And then I see the international community turning back and saying, when will you condemn what is going on with the Uyghur Muslims in China? And so, there is this back and forth between states. They're all using human rights as political point-scoring tools. And that is a huge problem.
Indeed, it is a huge problem, Sumani. But as I understand, what you are saying is the states are talking about human rights, but no one is really implementing what they're talking about in their own countries, right?
Unfortunately, that's the case.
Yeah. Okay, now, Muneeb, moving forward, you spoke about some leaders who have engaged in populism, who have engaged in what many would say is a far-right rhetoric. What do you think has emboldened those leaders in doing so? Do you think it has to do something with the fact that we, as the international community, have largely failed in effectively communicating human rights to the masses?
First of all, communicating human rights to the masses. I think people don't have any concept of human rights. They don't know what their rights are. I keep on asking my fellow Pakistanis that you only need to go onto the OHCHR's website and you need to read those reports known as concluding observations, which are issued by various UN treaty bodies, or the concluding observations which are issued by the Human Rights Council after the Universal Periodic Review, and you need to identify what your rights are. And why does your state need to defend itself every now and then in front of these bodies? It's because these are your rights. And somehow you are not being educated upon these. And you need to learn what your rights are. Because ultimately, human rights can be a very powerful tool. They have only fallen into the wrong hands. Right now, what is happening is...
If I may interject, now I think you have made a very, very good point here. We need to know what our rights are. What is the best way for us to learn what our rights are? Are there any good websites out there? Perhaps you could recommend some?
So I think their go-to website, the first place that you need to go is to the OHCHR website. Now, OHCHR website, that is the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. You will find all the treaties that I have named during our conversation, the individual treaties. You will find the treaty bodies and what they have said about your state. You will find those in PDF versions and in various languages, in your own local language as well. You will also find, the conclusions or the reports given by the UN Special Procedures, by UN Special Reporters. And, the amount of learning that there is, I can't even begin to explain. And I also feel that somehow, whenever I look at, the curriculum in schools or universities, there's very less emphasis on human rights studies. There's very less emphasis on human rights education. In my own country, there was a golden opportunity for inculcating human rights values into the syllabus, but I don't see any. There has been a new single national curriculum, and the stress is a lot on what the local audience would like. For local consumption, it's good. And it is a good PR exercise for the current government, for the ruling party. And this is again a global phenomenon in our neighboring India. I've seen the same thing, that they have come up with a single curriculum, but hardly any emphasis on human rights or the law. And, it's at a very young age. We need to teach our children what their rights are so that when they grow up, they do have degrees and qualifications in their hands, but they also learn how to respect others' rights as well as to stand up for their own rights. And like I said, it's just that these rights have fallen into the wrong hands. States are using these as propaganda tools. And in this day and age, you're talking about what sort of human rights crisis are we experiencing? There's also the menace of non-state actors. How does one distinguish between, state actors and non-state actors? Now, we've seen what's happened in Afghanistan after the 15th August takeover by the Taliban. Majority of the international community has not accorded them any recognition. So are they under, if it's not a government in the eyes of the international community, are the Taliban under any human rights obligations? Because it's the state, it's the government which owes these rights. If Taliban is not a government, what is it? Is it a non-state actor? If it's a non-state actor, then human rights law is not binding on them. Perhaps international humanitarian law might be, not human rights law. So this blurring. Also, are states committing human rights abuses by omission? For instance, I've just read what's happened in India. Just this week in Amritsar, there has been a lynching by some Sikhs in the Golden Temple. And politicians, they haven't condemned it. Now, are they creating an enabling environment for right-wing mobs to, start using street power? Because there is a very interesting concept in international law, and I don't want to take up too much time, but it's called due diligence. And the due diligence principle says that states are not only under negative duties, not to interfere with individuals' human rights, but they are also under positive duty to ensure that private entities or individuals do not commit human rights abuses. And if they do, they are brought to justice. Those human rights abuses ought to be investigated and redress needs to be provided to individuals. So my problem is, and we've also seen this in the United States with the Trump era, how politicians for their own political gains are empowering these right-wing mobs. We saw Donald Trump, equating right-wing mob groups like the QAnon with the Black Lives Matter movement. When the Charlottesville incident happened in 2017, whereby, right-wing white supremacists, they attacked and they drove over pro-democracy protesters, Donald Trump equated them. He said that, the behavior of both was uncivil. And that creates an enabling environment. We saw that culminating in what happened in Washington on 6th January with the US Capitol attacks. So the problem is that be it India, be it my own country,
so
where
the
I
problem,
listen to the politicians.
Right.
So
the problem is universal. The problem is universal. The issue of human rights violation is not limited to one particular region. It's happening all over the world.
It's becoming a trend.
Exactly. And this brings me to my next question. When it comes to a universal problem, I think a universal problem needs a universal solution, collective global response. And one body which could perhaps help countries in coming up with a collective global response is the United Nations. Do you think the United Nations has played an effective role in ensuring that human rights are upheld?
With a lot of disappointment, I have to say, no, it hasn't. And the reason being that very much like the international community, it is, the direction in which the United Nations moves is very much in accordance with political alliances and political interests. And the veto power in the Security Council, for example, is a major stumbling block. And I have something very interesting to tell you that, David Miliband, who was the former Foreign Secretary of the UK, he's just said this week that the Security Council will have to give up their veto power on at least cases of alleged mass atrocities. Now, if that happens, I think that could be the turning of the tide. What is meant by that is that the P5, the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, any one of them, depending on their political agenda, could veto any matter pertaining to a humanitarian crisis in the Security Council, and everything hits a roadblock. And there's no way forward. So, for example, the Israel-Palestine issue, which, again, reached its peak this summer, hasn't come to any conclusion. So many efforts have been put in, bringing this onto the international agenda, but it hasn't come to fruition. Why? Because, for example, the USA is going to veto because they are allies with Israel. Just recently, Russia used its veto power against a UN Security Council resolution casting the climate crisis as a threat to international peace and security. So when that happens, we've also been seeing how, China prevented any UN action against the Rohingya genocide in Myanmar. They used their veto. And this is what has been going on. And that is why there are so many human stories of suffering from Kashmir to Palestine to Myanmar to the minorities in India, or for that matter in my own country. And so that limits the effectiveness of international human rights law. It really makes one feel as if, these rights or these so-called universal rights exist only on paper. And then there are also, other organs of the United Nations like the International Court of Justice. And it's very disappointing that in 2007, when the International Court of Justice had itself admitted that, during the Yugoslavian war, what had been done to Bosnian Muslims by the Serbs, the acts amounted to genocide, but the intention for committing acts of genocide was not proven. I think that was a huge blow. How does one determine then? It becomes impossible to say that, there was an intent to commit genocide, going by the standards set by the ICJ. And that is why those international criminal tribunals had to step in. So the ICJ could also have done a lot. I hope that they do something about the complaint brought forward by Gambia in relation to genocide allegations against Myanmar, what they are doing to Rohingya community. Perhaps that could, act as some sort of damage control for the ICJ's reputation. But again, the ICJ hasn't done enough. Then there is the International Criminal Court. And the problem with that is that its remit is very limited. It's limited to only those individuals or officials involved in war crimes or crimes against humanity who belong to countries which are state parties, the Rome Statute on the ICC, and if their acts were committed on the territory of those state parties, or if the Security Council refers the matter to the ICC. But like I've said, almost everything is vetoed in the Security Council, at least everything that matters.
Exactly. And Muneeb, this is something we have been talking about for years, that the United Nations Security Council does not provide enough representation. It does not equally cover different regions. For example, it has only 5 members who have the power to veto anything the United Nations General Assembly discusses. So there's certainly inequality, injustice taking place within the United Nations. But so, of course, that is a different topic for another day. Now, the issue of human rights is one of the issue of human rights violations is perhaps one of the most pressing issues of our times. Certainly, these institutions such as the International Court of Justice, the United Nations, and many others have largely failed in addressing this issue. So let me ask you, what can we do on an individual level as human beings to protect the human rights of one another?
I think what needs to be done is that we need to educate ourselves. If our states are failing us, we need to look up. This is the digital age. And I think one of the greatest blessings is that there are cyber attacks and there is a lot of trolling as well. And there are negative effects of social media and too much reliance on the internet. But at the same time, there's a plethora of information available, which is just a single click away. So awareness is the first step. Also, with awareness, what happens is that somehow citizens start standing up for their rights. What is meant by rule of law is that there is no one set group of individuals which are above the law. All are subject to law. And what that means is that whatever your state is telling you, you don't just blindly believe it. You question back, because that is the social contract theory. And, it's very alarming how we keep on reading about powerful Israeli companies like NSO using the Pegasus spyware, how states are, clients for these spywares. Just today, I was reading that a UN expert who was looking into possible war crimes in Yemen committed by Saudi Arabia, his phone was hacked by the Saudi officials using the Pegasus spyware. And that also brings me to, we should be pressing for corporate responsibility. Why is it that only states are subject to international rights regimes? These corporates, which make huge profits, they are destroying our environment. We need to stand up for environmental justice. Environmental rights are also human rights. We need to identify what should count as crimes against humanity. Is it only limited to, for example, torture, extrajudicial killings, which, by the way, are rampant? Or should it also include things like vaccine inequity, environmental degradation, the use of corporate profit-making businesses by state clients to spy on journalists? Because again, there's a shrinking space for journalists. There's a shrinking space for freedom of expression. In a country which has fared relatively better, like the United Kingdom, they are talking about scrapping the Human Rights Act. Why? Because they're saying that, private interests do not prevail over public interests. They do not prevail over national security. And now national security is a tag that we need to be very wary of, because yes, national security is important, but how exactly do we define it? In India, for example, everyone who dissents is slapped with a UAPA notice and is labeled a terrorist. And who gets to defend that? The potential violators, i.e. the states themselves, they are going to come up with the self-suiting narrative. And so, once we educate ourselves, once we start standing up for ourselves, and at least if someone has a voice, if someone is learned enough, they need to be conducting more and more seminars, awareness programs. And because, when I look at, again, I'm going to give the example of my own country. There's also shrinking space for NGOs. The word NGO is used as if it's a very dirty word. And there have been laws which have been introduced which make it almost impossible for an NGO to register or to raise finances. And if the civil society is going to shrink into nothingness, who will keep a check and balance? So I think awareness, I believe, inculcating and instilling human rights values into education. I believe that those who are privileged enough, who have had an education in human rights, they should come forward and they should highlight, and not just highlight, they need to take up pro bono cases. For example, if I'm a lawyer, this is what I can do. I can take up pro bono cases. And the sad story is that for a lot of lawyers and even journalists, it does become very dangerous to take up controversial cases. There are some unspoken red lines which you're not supposed to cross. Okay, but how about we start questioning those red lines? For a start, we have to start from somewhere, because right now what is happening is individuals are being used as bargaining chips. For example, Nazneen Zaghari-Ratcliffe. She has been in prison in Iran for years. Why? Because they have some unsettled claims with the UK, or so I'm told. Belarus is pushing migrants into EU border through the Polish border and throwing dogs at them. They are being drowned in rivers. And then, the Polish forces are also committing acts of torture using tear gas against children. And I'm not saying that. You only need to read The Guardian. You only need to read. I was reading Human Rights Watch, and they literally talked about, weapons being used against children, child immigrants, When under the Refugee Convention of 1951, there is a principle of non-refoulement. You cannot send people away when they are on your soil. You have to consider their asylum applications. Being human is not illegal. What is illegal is what these states are doing. And that is what we need to be aware of.
Exactly. And I think you've made a great point. There are some red lines, and we should start questioning those red lines, because the priority at this point is to ensure that human rights, not just in a particular region, but across the world, are upheld. Muneeb Qadir, unfortunately, we are out of time. Certainly, we need a much longer discussion for this topic.
This could go on and on.
Exactly. Exactly. We need perhaps more than 6-7 hours to discuss the issue of human rights violations that are taking place in different parts of the world. But unfortunately, we're out of time. Muneeb Qadir, thank you very much for joining us today on this podcast. And thanks to our audience for tuning in.